This photograph of an escaped slave known as Whipped Peter, taken in 1863, is one of the most iconic images depicting the brutality of slavery in the US. Although slavery ended in 1865 with the signing of the 13th Amendment, the fight for justice and equality for African Americans persisted and continues today. Centuries of slavery and its aftermath of anti-black laws and segregation caused a tremendous wealth gap with disparities in housing, education, health, and even policing. African Americans today own less than 3% of the country's wealth, even though they make up 13% of its population. And beyond economic disparities, fatal police shootings of young African Americans has led to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and growing awareness about racism and its overarching impacts. Today, many argue that reparations for African Americans is the solution to settle the financial debt of centuries of past injustices and a remedy to America's racial wealth gap.
I picked the cotton, and I built the railroads. Under someone else's whip, for nothing. For nothing.
Reparation is a system of redress for historic injustices, and many Americans have received different forms of reparations in the past. Native Americans received land and some compensation for being forcibly exiled from their native lands. Japanese Americans, who were held captive in internment camps during World War II, received reparations and a presidential apology. And even at a local level, states like North Carolina have compensated victims for its forced sterilization programs that ended in the mid-1970s. But Black Americans have not received reparations for slavery or for the impacts of the racial discrimination that followed. Supporters of reparations argue that financial compensation for descendants of slaves is key to addressing the stark inequality between Black and white households.
I feel a sense of anger where we are in the United States of America, where we have not had direct conversations about a lot of the root causes of the inequities and the pain and the hurt manifested in economic disparities, manifested in health disparities, manifested in a criminal justice system that is indeed a form of new Jim Crow.
In 2018, nearly 1 in 3 Black children lived in poverty, compared to 1 in 11 white children in the US. And in 2019, the median wealth for a white family was nearly 8 times greater than the average Black family. Some proposals of reparations are calling for direct restitutions, while others are arguing in favor of tax cuts, and some say compensation should come in the form of investments in Black communities like scholarship funds. William A. Darity, an economist at Duke University and a leading scholar on reparations, established 2 qualifying conditions for people who could receive reparations. First, having at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, and second, having identified oneself as Black or African American on a legal document for at least 12 years before the approval of any reparations. According to these criteria, former President Barack Obama, the son of a white American mother and a Kenyan father, would not receive reparations, while former First Lady Michelle Obama, whose ancestors were enslaved, would. According to different studies and estimates, the reparation costs may amount to somewhere between 10 and 18 trillion US dollars. The momentum gained by the Black Lives Matter movement has pushed conversations about reparations to the forefront, despite being regarded as too radical in the past. During the 2020 presidential campaign, most Democratic candidates said they were in favor of setting up a committee to look into reparations, including President Joe Biden. And in 2021, a legislation focusing on how the US can apologize for slavery and make reparations is getting renewed attention in Congress. Some lawmakers have been trying to advocate for a federal effort to study slavery reparation for decades with no success, but the killing of George Floyd and the unrest that followed have put more pressure on officials to act and consider reparations. So let's try to unpack how past injustices created the problems African Americans face today. By the 19th century, slavery had become America's largest financial asset. The value of enslaved people in 1860 was worth more than all the capital invested in railroads and factories combined at the time. Slaveholders had unjustly benefited from centuries of unpaid labor, all on the backs of millions of slaves. The first major opportunity that the United States had to atone for slavery was right after the Civil War, when 20 black community leaders in Savannah met Union leaders, including General William Sherman, and agreed that each black family should receive 40 acres of land and an additional mule as an act of reparation. Sherman signed Field Order 15 and allocated 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to black families. But this moment was short-lived. Less than 3 months after Sherman's order, President Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, who was a former slaveholder himself, was elected as president. Johnson rescinded the order, and tens of thousands of freedmen were forcibly evicted and the land redistributed among southern plantation owners. The reversal left many newly freed slaves with few options but to become sharecroppers, often working for former slaveholders. In fact, many newly freed slaves ended up working on plantations in return for food and shelter. The former Confederates returned to power and found new ways to circumvent the federal laws and find loopholes from which they could benefit. A collection of laws were enacted from the end of the Civil War till 1968 that targeted black people, black codes, Jim Crow laws, and other statutes rescinded African American voting rights, restricted labor opportunities, and legalized segregation. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose to prominence during this era. The group served as a private club for Confederate veterans, and they terrorized African Americans, torturing and killing many. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it permitted involuntary servitude as punishment for crimes. Black men were imprisoned for a range of made-up offenses, and as prisoners, they were leased to businesses and farms to work for free under brutal conditions. Frustrated with the hostile environment of the South, African Americans began to mass migrate towards the north and west of the country. But even decades after emancipation, the presumption of danger and criminality still followed black people everywhere they went. By the 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of this New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. As part of the National Housing Act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps of over 200 US cities to grade neighborhoods on their credit worthiness. Black and immigrant areas received a worse grade and were shaded red, a policy now known as redlining. Neighborhoods were color-coded. Green meant best, a neighborhood worthy of credit. Blue meant still desirable. Yellow meant that a neighborhood was in decline, while neighborhoods coded in red, where most African Americans lived, were considered hazardous and posed a great risk for mortgages. These maps were used for decades by many American banks to determine who they would grant loans to. This housing discrimination effectively blocked black families from owning homes and acquiring wealth that could be passed down to future generations. Today, 2/3 of America's middle-class wealth is in the form of home ownership. Denying African Americans the opportunity to own houses meant denying them opportunities to climb the social ladder. And even though redlining was banned with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, its lingering effects still continue to this day. 60% of communities living in areas classified as hazardous in the 1930s remain low-income communities today, inhabited by minority residents, mostly Black and Latino. Homes in these areas are, on average, valued 25% less than homes in white neighborhoods. On the other side of the equation, 91% of areas classified as best in the 1930s now belong primarily to people with middle to upper incomes, of which 85% of them are white. Redlining policies didn't only impact housing and wealth, but also policing and education. Public school funding comes from local property taxes, and the higher the property values, the higher the taxes. This means black neighborhoods tend to have poorer schools, and when it comes to policing, data of arrests in black neighborhoods reveals that if you live in redlined areas, you are 3 times more likely to be arrested. And even when it comes to bail, people who live in black neighborhoods in redlined areas are targeted with higher bail amounts. In Maryland, 13 out of its 15 zip codes with the highest bail costs are in redlined areas. Inside courtrooms, the problem gets worse. 67% of the US prison population are people of color. Although black people make up only 13% of the US population, African American adults are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. As of 2001, 1 in every 3 black boys born in that year are expected to go to prison in their lifetime, as compared to 1 in every 17 white boys. While fatal police encounters have ignited the Black Lives Matter movement and drawn attention to the institutional violence African Americans face, the fight for racial justice is mainly about equality in opportunities and access to wealth, which cannot be attained without structural change. The pandemic has revealed how these inequalities translate to healthcare as well. According to research from the Harvard Medical School and the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice, COVID-19 is disproportionately infecting and killing Black Americans as a result of centuries of structural racism. The group of researchers modeled how reparations could have affected Black communities if they had been introduced well before the pandemic and subsequently reduced the equity gap between Blacks and whites. They found that coronavirus transmission in Louisiana alone could have been reduced by 31 to 68% for all races. The pandemic has killed 1 in 1,000 Black Americans, twice the rate of white Americans. Many argue that this disproportionate rate of infection and fatality is further proof as to why reparations are a much-needed step for America's long overdue awakening to systemic racism.